I declare war. So as you all know, this is Black History Month. But we're not celebrating Black History Month right now. We're going to talk about Coon History Month. And some people will say, why use a term like coon? That's an offensive racist term. Why describe another black man as a coon? And what I'm going to do is explain why I use that term. And in particular, I'm going to focus on this man and his history. But let's start it off by saying this. This is a man who, instead of using his education and his power and influence to help black people, this man has used his education to undermine the interests of his own people. He has used his education and his power to be a detriment to his own people. And when somebody does that, they deserve to be condemned. They deserve to be ostracized. They deserve to be alienated from the community. And what better way to alienate somebody than to use an offensive term like coon to describe them? This man is worse than those black-faced minstrels that our parents used to see on television with the black face and the white gloves, the ones that would behave like complete buffoons and idiots, perpetuating negative stereotypes about black people. This man is worse than those people because this man isn't just presenting any kind of negative image of black people. This man is using his position and power to undermine the civil rights of black people, the rights that our ancestors and our elders fought and died for, bled for, went to jail for. This man is using his power after gaining so much from the civil rights movement to undermine the very movement that made it possible for this man to be on the Supreme Court today. And you would think that this man, with his experiences, that this man would be enlightened. You would think that this man would have had some kind of race consciousness or some kind of love for his people, some kind of compassion for his people, but the opposite is true. This man experienced discrimination. While this man was attending a seminary, he overheard a white student talking about the assassination of Martin Luther King. Shortly after the assassination of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, Clarence Thomas overheard a classmate talking about that. And I'm going to tell you what the classmate said. As you can see, this is Wikipedia. I'll include a link in the description box so that you could read it for yourself. But here it talks about how he was at this seminary and he heard this student say, right after the assassination of Martin Luther King, "Good, I hope the son of a bitch died." This is somebody speaking at a religious institution talking about they hope the son of a bitch dies. And that prompted Clarence Thomas to decide to transfer to another college. He transferred to the College of the Holy Cross to get an education. And while there, he decided to create the Black Student Union on campus. And one of the issues that they focused on was unfair disciplinary practices on the university. You know, how they would have double standards, one for black people and one for white people. So that was an issue that was important to him. He actually staged a walkout, from what I read at that time. And you would think that those experiences would lead this man to be conscious and aware and concerned about his people. But we'll find out that the opposite is true. Now, this man went on to go to Yale Law School and graduate from Yale Law School. And after he graduated, he found it very difficult to get a job with one of the big law firms. You know, often people that go to those Ivy League colleges, you know, one of the things that they try to do is get a job with a big firm. And usually that's an easy task for someone that's graduated from one of these top tier universities. But Clarence Thomas found it difficult to get a job. And he assumed that that was because people didn't think that he really deserved to get a law degree. The people assumed that because he went to the university that he obviously got it as a part of some kind of quota or affirmative action program. And so for that reason, according to him, he didn't think that they took his degree seriously. And he had become so bitter and so outraged with that he began to devalue his education. And from what I recall, he allegedly just took off a sticker from a cigar that had a price on it, like the sticker said like 95 cents or something like that. And he placed that sticker on his law degree, basically saying that that law degree was of no value to him. So this man had bitterness. And you would think that his experience with this alleged employment discrimination would make him more militant or more concerned about employment discrimination and the wrongs that African Americans face. But the opposite is true. Instead of attacking racism, this man decided to turn inward and attack affirmative action. Attack it, even though affirmative action made it possible for this man to get an education, made it possible for this man to go to law school. And this article in Wikipedia points out how this man was influenced by Thomas Sowell. This book on race and economics, that was an influencing factor on him. It helped shape his political philosophy. And this man embraces a certain type of philosophy when it comes to the Constitution. He believes in a strict interpretation of the text as it is, as the framers intended it to be interpreted. And such an interpretation is conservative. Such an interpretation is detrimental to the black community. And we'll go into that a little bit later. But this man, despite all his rhetoric about self-reliance and, the typical conservative, pull yourself up by your bootstrap philosophy, this man's whole career was based on on what white handlers were able to do for him. White people made it possible for this man to have every position that he ever earned or ever obtained. At first he worked as assistant attorney general in Missouri under John Danforth, who would later go on to become a U.S. senator, and then Clarence Thomas would work under him as a legislative assistant. And then later on, Clarence Thomas was appointed to be Assistant Secretary for Civil Rights at the U.S. Department of Education. And in 1982, President Ronald Reagan appointed Clarence Thomas to be the chairman of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. And while he was at the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, instead of being a fierce advocate against employment discrimination, this man decided to limit the use of class action lawsuits. And we all know that class action lawsuits is one of the major vehicles that is used to protect the rights of people. It enables and it empowers people that don't have much resources. It makes it possible for them to pool their resources with other people who have had similar experiences. In this context, people who have been discriminated against in their employment. That's one of the most influential and powerful ways to affect change in the law is through class action lawsuits. But this man decided to limit the use of those types of lawsuits. And you would think that someone who allegedly experienced employment discrimination would do everything that they could to empower plaintiffs, empower them by using more and more class action lawsuits. But this man does the complete opposite. And that should have been a sign right there to let people know that this man would not be a benefit to the black community. Would not at all. And later on, he would be appointed to the U.S. Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit. The first George Bush would be the one to appoint him to that position, and then months later, like 16 months later, he would go on to be appointed to be a justice at the Supreme Court. And we all know what happened there. We understand that he went through the confirmation hearings, and you had Anita Hill accuse him of sexual harassment. But despite that, he was confirmed eventually by the Senate. He was confirmed, and he has been on the Supreme Court ever since. Now, since he's been on the Supreme Court, he's made several decisions, or he supported several positions that have been detrimental to black people. But for the purpose of this video right here, I'm just going to focus on two of those. The first one is voting rights. And that case is Shelby County versus Holder. And in that case, the Supreme Court struck down Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act by a vote of 5-4. And this man, Clarence Thomas, was one of the people that voted to strike down Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act. So now we no longer have the protection of Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, because Section 4 established the formula that was used to decide which states and jurisdictions are subject to preclearance. Preclearance was a system set up whereby states that had a history of discriminating against African American voters were required to pre-clear any changes to their voting laws, pre-clear them with the Justice Department or federal courts before they could implement them. And that was designed to prevent discrimination before it occurred, to prevent those jurisdictions with a history of discriminating against African American voters from enacting laws that are discriminatory. And that was a huge weapon against voter discrimination, because it made it possible to stop discrimination before it could even be manifest. It made it easier to stop these types of actions without all the expenditure of resources and litigation expenses and all that kind of stuff. So that was a key tool to stop voter suppression and discrimination against African American voters. But now that is no longer in place. Now there is no pre-clearance requirement for those jurisdictions that had a history of poll taxes, a history of literacy tests, and other discriminatory measures against African Americans. Now we no longer have that protection. So as a result of that, you have states like Texas imposing discriminatory voter ID laws. You have states like North Carolina imposing discriminatory voter laws, taking that state backwards. As soon as this decision was rendered, all these states and all these jurisdictions that had been eager to make it more difficult for black people to vote, they began to implement laws designed to do just that, make it more difficult for black people to vote. Like North Carolina, they tried to set up voter ID requirements. They tried to cut back on early voting. They tried to get rid of same-day voter registration, and they imposed all other kinds of restrictions against African American voters, these restrictions designed to suppress black voters. And that would not have been possible. It would not have been possible for them to even pass such laws if Section 4 and 5 were still in place. But because of a man like Clarence Thomas, we no longer had those protections. Because of this Coon, we no longer had those protections. So now you have civil rights organizations that are forced to use their resources to bring lawsuits under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act to try to defend our rights. And this law that was passed in North Carolina was struck down by one court under Section 2. And they pointed out how that law was designed to target black communities with surgical precision. And that wouldn't have been possible, again, if it wasn't for Clarence Thomas helping to strike down a key provision of the Voting Rights Act, literally gutting the act. And that kind of decision that impacts our community obviously is detrimental. And that's one of the reasons why I call this man a coon. I have to call him that. And then the last matter that I'll look at is affirmative action. This man has used his position to attack affirmative action. This man, in the case of Fisher versus the University of Texas, said that he would have gone further and he would have banned any consideration of race in public college admissions. Thank goodness, the Supreme Court decided to uphold affirmative action by a vote of 5-4. And this man, he was on the wrong side. He was voting to end affirmative action. And to understand what affirmative action is, you just have to understand this. It is not a quota. Quotas have been ruled to be unconstitutional and illegal a long time ago. So we're not talking about a quota. We're not talking about a situation where somebody gets into college just based on their race. That's not what we're talking about when we talk about affirmative action. We're talking about a system where race is just one of many factors considered by schools when admitting students. One of many factors, a factor of a factor. It's not the dominant factor. And affirmative action has made it possible for people like a Clarence Thomas to get an education, for people like myself to get an education, to get law degrees, etc. But here you have a man who, after reaping the benefits of affirmative action, wants to burn the bridge so that no one else can cross over with him. He wants to leave his black brothers and sisters behind. And affirmative action is a modest measure towards some kind of social justice, a modest measure to say the least. It's a measure that promotes diversity on college campuses. It is not a measure, unfortunately, that's focused on remedying, or addressing past discrimination. So it is modest, a modest measure to try to open doors of opportunity to black people. But yet you have this shucking and jiving, shoe shining, ass kissing house Negro using his position of power to try to destroy affirmative action. And, the court keeps going in the direction that it's going in right now. We will see the end of affirmative action. And our children and grandchildren will not have the same opportunities that we had as a result of people like Clarence Thomas. So this is the first edition of Coon History Month. Tell me what you think. And before I even conclude, I have to throw in one other thing before I go. I mean, not only is this man detrimental in his decisions, but you can't be a coon without having a white wife. That's mandatory. You have to have a white wife in order to be a coon. So this man has him a white wife. He has him a white life. He is assimilated, and he is using everything in his power to undermine his people. And that's why he's featured on here. So tell me what y'all think. Please rate, comment, and subscribe. Peace.